In the last episode, Lister, who is trapped on the surface of a world that turns out to be the Earth blown out of orbit, has been adopted as a king by a tribe of giant cockroaches. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew of Red Dwarf have been sucked into a black hole and, thanks to the talkie toaster, blown back out again. Now all they have to do is rescue Lister. Rimmer and the cat land on the planet near the wreckage of Starbug, but can find no sign of him until, in the distance, they see a tiny figure dragging a handmade plough across a half-furrowed field. Chris Barry performs Episode 6.
It's Lister! It's gotta be!
Rimmer and the cat half slid, half tumbled down into the valley and ran across the fields towards the figure. When they were 200 yards away, they realized they were wrong. It wasn't Lister. It was an old man, grey-haired and slightly bent. He had the strong muscle tone and weathered skin of a farmer who spent a lifetime in the fields. He was fit and strong, but he had to be at least 60, maybe more. He gazed at them for a while from under the thick, furry white caterpillars of his eyebrows. Then he mopped his brow with a leathery forearm and turned back to his plough.
Old man!
Rimmer panted.
We're looking for someone. A friend of ours crashed just over the hill.
The cat pointed, but the old man didn't look. Instead, with his back still to them, he performed a passable impersonation of Rimmer's voice.
I'll be back, the old man said. Trust me.
He turned and pulled off his cap. Rimmer crooked his head to one side and studied the old man's features. Lister? He said, his eyes half pinched in disbelief. Lister shook his head.
Where the smeg have you been?
We got here as quick as we could.
Quick!
Lister bellowed.
Quick!
It's only been 16 days. Rimmer looked at the old man Lister had become. My God! It must be the time dilation.
The what?
The ship got stuck in a black hole. Time moves more slowly around a black hole. Relativity. From our point of view, you've only been away a couple of weeks.
I've been here on my own, waiting for you to bring me some food. For the last 34 years. 34 smaggin' years.
The cat spun round, taking in the whole valley.
You did all this yourself?
Lister grunted.
This was all garbage before, and you made it into this?
Lister grunted again. He hadn't spoken much English for over a third of a century. He turned and squinted across the fields. Rimmer followed his sightline towards a herd of animals grazing at the very edge of the valley. Lister slid his two thumbs into his mouth and emitted a piercing, wavering whistle. One of the herd looked up from its feeding and broke into a trot. As they watched, the creature suddenly lifted off into the air and headed skyborne towards them. The giant 8-foot-long cockroach landed neatly between the screaming cat and the hysterical Rimmer. Its mandibles rubbed tenderly up the back of Lister's legs, and he patted its thorax fondly, cooing his strange clicks and whistles all the time.
They eat all the garbage,
Lister said, and climbed on its back.
Hop on.
The cat twisted and gyrated, scratching every spare inch of flesh.
Yeah, it's a cockroach.
You expect us to sit on this thing? Rimmer said between heaves.
It's 6 miles back to the house.
6 miles? Is that all? Rimmer swept both his hands forward. You guys go on ahead. I feel like a jog.
What? No, I'm coming with you,
said the cat. The cockroach clicked and whistled and animatedly rubbed its bristling back legs together.
He's getting upset. He thinks you don't like him.
No.
Where did he get that idea? I think he's really cute. Cockroaches have always been my all-time favorite insects. I especially love those black sticky hairs on the back of his legs and that sort of slimy stuff that dribbles out of his mandibles. He's adorable. Wow!
Get on. You two. Lister nodded at Rimmer. They slung their legs over the roach's back, and it pattered along until it reached takeoff speed, then fluttered noisily up into the sky. What's that? Rimmer pointed down at a field below them. There were no crops in the field, just yellow and white flowers which were arranged and planted to spell out two enormous letters. 2 Ks. "Jasmine," said Lister simply, and Rimmer let it go at that. Lister's home was made entirely of garbage. The walls were built from waste paper, compressed into bricks that made them as hard as any wood. The roof slates were fashioned from beaten-out flattened bean tins, and the windows were the portholes taken from front-loading washing machines. As they walked across the courtyard, a number of young roaches flocked out excitedly to meet them. They yapped, clicked and whistled round Lister's ankles as he patted each of them and made his way to the main house. While Lister busied himself in the kitchen, Rimmer and the cat sat on a remarkably comfortable sofa which was clearly 3 toilets lashed together, covered with bin liners stuffed with what turned out to be vacuum cleaner fluff. There was an elaborate hand-carved wooden mantelpiece over the stone hearth. It looked strangely incongruous in the jerry-built room. Above it hung an ornate gilt frame which at first glance appeared to be empty. Rimmer stood up. On closer inspection, he found there was a picture in the middle of it. A less-than-passport-size photograph which had been cut out of the Red Dwarf yearbook. It was the photograph Lister always used to keep in his wallet. It was his only photograph of Christine Kochanski, smiling her famous pinball smile. Lister shuffled in from the kitchen, his wrinkled hands clutching a tray loaded with roughly thrown clay pots. He saw Rimmer looking at the thumbnail-sized photograph and smiled. "One day, I'll get her back." Rimmer and the cat looked at the frail old man Lister had become and nodded in benign indulgence. It seemed fruitless to point out she'd died 3 million years previously, and even when she had been alive, she'd been the one who broke off the relationship, dumping him for some guy who worked in flight navigation. Crichton craned over the crumpled, handwritten recipe sheet he'd been given by Lister. It was Lister's own concoction, chamois kebabs diabolo, which he'd once claimed proudly had put Peterson in the medical unit for over a week. But surely there was some mistake. The amount of chili peppers called for could have launched a 3-stage deep space probe from Houston Mission Control to the outer reaches of the galaxy. This wasn't a chamois kebab. It was a thermonuclear device. Thin, fast beads of water battered over Lister's body as he gloried in the warmth of the shower. He filled his cupped palm with a ludicrously generous amount of shampoo and massaged it into his already well-lathered scalp. He blinked through sudded eyes at his reflection in the cubicle's mirrored wall. It was strange having an old body. He still thought of himself as a permanent 25. But there was no getting away from it. He now lived in a body that was 9 years away from being 70. Nearly 70. He heard a voice through the shower's roar and turned down the taps. It was Crichton.
"Ready in 2 minutes, Mr. Lister, sir."
Lister smiled. He was 2 minutes away from his first chamois kebab in 3.5 decades. He'd given up meat, of course, on Garbage World, and he had no regrets about that. But chamois kebabs were something else. Fantasizing about this Indian hors d'oeuvre had kept him going when times had been rough. And now he was going to have one. He chuckled out loud and began clicking and whistling an upbeat cockroach song as he rinsed the soap from his hair. Crichton pulled on 3 sets of oven gloves, one on top of the other, and took the 3 sausage-shaped kebabs out of the oven. They looked innocent enough, but quite frankly he'd have felt safer handling them wearing an asbestos suit, preferably with long-range remote-controlled mechanical arms. These babies were hot. He put the plate on the sleeping quarters table and backed away nervously.
"Dinner is served, sir."
Lister stepped out of the cubicle, tugging together the cords of his shower robe.
Chamois kebabs!
He orgasmed.
34 years! I hope you haven't skimped on the old chilies there, Crichton's old buddy old pal.
Crichton turned from the wash basin at the sounds of Lister's agonized writhing. Lister gagged. His face started to blacken. His desperate fingers clawing at the choking kebab, his legs kicking and bucking. Lister? Rimmer crouched over Lister's immobile form. Lister? Crichton hurried over and knelt by his side. He looked down at Lister's grey face. Is he okay?
He's had a heart attack.
Crichton gently rolled Lister's head to one side and felt the side of his neck for a pulse. Is he okay? Rimmer said again. Crichton reached forward, and his open palm closed Lister's eyes. The funeral of the last remaining member of the human race was neither a solemn nor a somber affair. Quite the opposite. Lister's favourite dance track, Born to Brutalize, thumped out of his old wax blaster with such force it shook the coffin. Crichton, Rimmer and the cat stood around the metal casket, wearing green day-glow dealy-boppers, battery-propelled revolving bow ties and yellow fishing waders, precisely as Lister had requested in his last will and testament. The cat gently placed a sealed foil tray of chicken vindaloo by Lister's feet, followed by 2 spicy poppadoms and an onion salad. Crichton shuffled along behind him and placed 3 six-packs of leopard lager in the coffin, together with Lister's one and only photograph of Christine Kochanski. As Born to Brutalize reached its climactic nuclear guitar solo, they sealed the casket lid and fired the coffin off into space. "Bye, man," said Rimmer quietly, and the 3 of them turned and shuffled sadly out of the waste disposal bay. Crichton busied himself setting the table for the wake. None of them felt much like drinking, but Lister had insisted they each consume an entire bottle of Cinzano Bianco. "I suppose someone should tell Holly," said Rimmer. The cat nodded. Rimmer slouched off to the drive room. "On," said Rimmer, and Holly's pixelized face materialized onto the screen. "Sorry to bother you, Hol, but we've got some bad news. It's Lister. He's dead." Holly nodded. "I thought you'd want to know." "Yes." Holly paused for 2 of his valuable remaining seconds. "How?" "Heart attack." Rimmer sketched in the details. Holly listened, and when Rimmer had finished, he simply said, "Oh," and switched himself off. Rimmer had passed under the drive room exit hatch and was halfway down the corridor before the noise started. He wheeled round and walked back into the drive room. Every single printer was churning out ream after ream of calculations and instructions. Rimmer stood in the hatchway and his face yielded to a grin, which in turn gave way to laughter. Not his normal, hollow, braying, empty laughter. This was an altogether different noise. This was a noise his vocal cords had never been called on to make before. It was the laughter of joy. At first, there was nothing. Then, there was something. It was a light, a tiny shard of brilliance that shocked him with its suddenness. Then, there was nothing again. There was no way of telling how long it lasted. Nothing has no time. Then the light again, and across the face of the light, dark shapes began to move. He watched as the shapes became faces. They were concerned faces, gentle, kindly. Then he lost consciousness. He dreamed of a garden pungent with jasmine. He knew the garden, but he had no idea where or when he knew it from. Then pain. Something imploded in his chest. He lurched upright, and there was a second implosion, and the pain was gone. He drifted back off to sleep. When he awoke, it was dusk. He was in a bed with clean white cotton sheets tightly tucked into the sides. There was a green screen around the bed, so the rest of the room was obscured from him. By the bedside, on a cabinet, there was a huge vase full of jasmine with some kind of greeting card nestling among the yellow flowers. His left arm, for some reason, felt weak and helpless, so he reached up with his right and plucked the card from its place. In the half-light, his old eyes couldn't focus on the inscription. He replaced the card and, overcome with weariness, slid back into sleep. When he woke again, he was moving. Fluorescent lights streaked past above him. He tried to raise his head, but a friendly hand patted him down again as the hospital trolley raced along the white-tiled corridor. They burst through 3 sets of overlapping rubber doors, and suddenly they were outside in the biting wind of the cold winter air. There was a jerk, and the stretcher was hoisted off the trolley. There was a commotion. People were shouting things he didn't understand, and all the time the pain in his chest was getting worse. 2 men ran with a stretcher and slid him into the back of a waiting ambulance. The doors slammed closed, and the ambulance screeched off. An oxygen mask loomed over him, and once again he blacked out. He came to as the ambulance doors swung open, and the same 2 men hauled his stretcher out of the vehicle and set it down on a pavement in the middle of a circle of people.
"What's happening?"
he bleated pathetically. Gingerly, the 2 men eased him off the stretcher and placed him on the cold, hard pavement. One of them packed up the stretcher and dashed back with it to the ambulance, while the other twisted his leg so it folded under his body, then lifted up his head and slid his arm underneath it. The pain was unbearable now. He tilted his head weakly and watched as the 2 men jumped into the ambulance and reversed off into the busy traffic. He lay on his back, peripherally aware of the circle of onlookers. One by one, the onlookers began to drift away, until eventually he was totally alone, lying in his unnatural pose on the pavement. The pain reached a crescendo and imploded in his chest. He jumped to his feet, staggered along a shop window, regained his balance, and started to walk slowly down the street. The worst of the pain had subsided. Just a sharp ache in his left arm remained, and his breathing was beginning to come more easily. After 10 minutes, he didn't feel too badly at all, and decided to go for a coffee. He found a cafe just a few shops down, and sat at one of the red plastic tables. Almost immediately, a waitress came over and set down a plate of money. Then she smiled at him pleasantly and scurried off. Soon after, she returned with some crockery, a cup, a saucer, and a plate. The cup was dirty. It had a coffee ring around the top, and there was some half-dissolved sugar in the bottom. The plate was dirty too. It was covered in crumbs, and in the middle there was a huge blob of mayonnaise. He held up his hand to call back the waitress, but suddenly he realized he was going to be sick. Liquid gushed up his throat, but he managed to catch it in the coffee cup. But he hadn't been sick. He looked into the cup. It was half full of coffee. Then he was filled with panic again. This time he definitely was going to be sick. He reached up to his mouth and regurgitated a perfectly shaped triangular tuna and mayonnaise sandwich. 3 other quarters followed in fast succession, along with a sliver of cucumber, a slice of tomato, and a small portion of watercress.
"Help,"
he said quietly. His throat gurgled again, and he filled the coffee cup to the top. He smelt the cup. It was coffee. Fresh. Steam was coming off it. He dipped his teaspoon in and swirled it around. When he brought the spoon out again, it was full of sugar. He left the cafe, deciding he needed some fresh air. All the traffic was going backwards. What was this place? What was he doing here? When he next looked around, he found he'd wandered off the main street and was in a dimly lit alley. He felt panicked and alone. Suddenly he heard urgent footsteps coming towards him from behind. Before he could turn, the man was on him, pressing him up against a wall and holding a short silver knife against his throat. Deftly, the mugger fastened a watch around the old man's wrist, then slipped a wallet into the inside pocket of the old man's coat. He watched, bemused, as the mugger flipped closed the blade of his knife, smiled with false charm, and raced off down the alley.
"Help,"
the old man said quietly.
"What's happening to me?"
He opened the wallet and looked inside. Astonishingly, his own photograph was in one of the credit card compartments. There was a driving license, too. The name on the license was Retsil Divad. It took the old man a good 10 minutes to realize the name was his. Because, like everything else in this crazy place, his name was backwards. 4,000 dull gunmetal grey canisters lay stacked in neat ranks in the scoop room of White Giant's cargo section.
"Here's some more,"
said Crichton as a fresh haul of canisters clattered down the chute. He read the numbers, and then one by one tossed them to the cat, who began to pile them alongside the others. "Has anyone even the vaguest, remotest idea what it is we're doing here?" asked Rimmer. The cat and Crichton grunted verbal shrugs. The truth was, none of them even pretended to begin to understand the list of instructions, data, formulae and coordinates Holly had left them. More canisters scuttled down the chute, and once again Crichton studied the numbers.
Got it!
He squealed with delight and clapped his hands. It had been easy enough collecting Lister's coffin and returning it to a stasis booth on Red Dwarf, but the second instruction was a little more bizarre. They had to locate a swarm of canisters floating through space at a certain set of coordinates and bring aboard the one numbered 1121. Holly had failed to mention there would be something in the region of 10,000 of these canisters, and the search had taken them the best part of 5 weeks. "What next?" asked Rimmer as he craned over Crichton's shoulder, trying to read the indecipherable machine code.
I'm supposed to bombard it with X-rays, gamma rays, all kinds of stuff.
"Then what?" Crichton consulted Holly's sheet again.
We take Lister's body on a little trip.
"Where?"
Through the black hole, into the Omni-Zone, to a particular planet in Universe 3. Apparently we're to bury him there.
"Universe 3? What's so special about Universe 3?
Well, apart from the fact that it's almost a mirror image of our own universe, except that time moves backwards there, there's nothing very special about it at all."
The cat shook the canister.
What's this got to do with anything?
I don't know.
Crichton flipped through the instructions.
Maybe some chemical we have to use later.
"I don't think so." Rimmer tried to suffocate a smirk. "I've got a pretty good idea what is in there, and I don't think you'll find it's a chemical." He raised an enigmatic eyebrow and walked back to the cockpit, whistling happily. So, time was running backwards. It had taken Lister a while to figure it out, but if he reversed the events of the day, it all seemed to come together. He'd walked down a dark alley where a mugger had stolen his watch and his wallet. In a daze, he'd stumbled through the streets until he came across a cafe where he'd had a coffee and something to eat to calm his nerves. Obviously it hadn't worked, because he'd gone out into the street, suffered a heart attack, and been rushed to hospital. After a few hours slipping in and out of consciousness, he'd suffered a second heart attack and died. Except, of course, it had all happened backwards. He looked at the address on his driving license. A cab screeched up backwards beside him. He leaned in the window, accepted the fare and the tip from the cabbie, and climbed in. There was a newspaper jammed down the side of the bench seat. A thought struck him, and he turned to the obituaries column. And there he was, Retzel Divad. It took him a while to translate the accompanying backward text. David Lister, age 61, joyfully brought to life on Thursday the 21st at 11:30 p.m. See personal column. Lister feverishly ripped through the pages and found the personal column. He traced his finger down the entries and stopped when he found one that was printed forwards. Dave Lister, it said, sure everything will become clear to you. This was the only way. Obviously can't be with you. Everyone would get younger. We'll pick you up in 36 years. Be at Niagara Falls by the souvenir shop at noon precisely. See you then. Good luck from the Red Dwarf crew. They'd done it again. They'd marooned him in some insane part of the universe, expecting him to cope alone for the best part of 40 years. To do that once was bad enough. To do it twice in consecutive lifetimes, that was sheer bad manners. Finally, the cab screeched to a start outside the address on the driving license. He was home, whatever that meant. The taxi door flung itself open, and Lister climbed out. He took the key from his wallet, walked up the path to the house and let himself in. It was a big house. Whatever he was destined to do for a living, it looked like he was destined to do it pretty successfully. He walked into the first reception room. Framed photographs jostled for position on the old stone mantelpiece. Something in one of the photographs caught his eye, and he scrutinized the others more closely. Impossible. It just wasn't possible. Not even with an IQ of 12,000. But the evidence was there, in the photographs. Somehow, Holly had done it. He turned and watched the lace curtains fluttering in the breeze from the open French windows. He crossed the room and stepped out into the garden. At the end of the lawn, an old woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat was clipping away at the jasmine borders. She looked up and saw him, and her face crinkled into a famous pinball smile. 36 years. They would grow young together. They had a whole new past to look forward to. The old man's face crinkled into a smile of its own, and he started shuffling down the garden towards her.
Red Dwarf, Better Than Life, was written by Grant Naylor and performed by Chris Barry. Additional music and effects were by Nick Graham. Technical presentation by John Etchells. Produced by Chris Wallace.